Hi, Chris. How are you?
A little better, a little better. I mean, been hectic so far, but this week I should be able to catch up on a lot of stuff, especially those homework assignments.
Okay, sounds good. How's your internship going?
Actually, I was gonna talk to you about that. I think I'm gonna have to drop out because I don't know how my job is gonna be. And I know, was it Sarah, Nancy, keeps calling me saying that I have job interviews lined up for me,
Oh,
but
yeah.
but I don't want to take if I do if see I'm afraid if I take the job interview and then I get sent some because I'm most likely to get sent to Long Beach in the next month or so for my job. So I don't want to take a job with here and then then gonna have to quit the intern or the apprenticeship if especially if someone else can get that job, that position. I'd rather get it then have that opportunity to get it than for me to get it then have to quit. No, not a week or two into it. You get what I'm saying? I don't
Well, you you don't want to do the apprenticeship, or you do want to do the apprenticeship?
I no that's what I was saying. I don't think I'm gonna be able to continue forward with the apprenticeship for that sole reason that I don't know exactly where my job's gonna when my job's gonna I'm gonna have to go into the office again. I mean, I haven't been to the office, but there's most likely it's gonna be between either the next few weeks that I'm gonna have to start reporting to the office, and the office will be in Long Beach.
Okay. And how long
So,
is your internship last?
which one?
The one that you're doing now?
Oh no, I'm not doing. I have a job actually.
Oh, you're not doing the Infosys one?
Yeah, it's not an internship. It's a full job, full time job now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well, it's up to you. You don't, of course, you have an existing job and you don't want to pick up another job. You should just let them know so that way they can give it to the next student. It is a permanent position, um, and it could be varied from going to job sites or working remotely. So it depends on
yeah,
the employer. Some employers they would require you to work remotely for most part, and then some employers they actually require that you
yeah.
go
I,
to
I
sites.
I think she talked to there's one company that was interested in, but they couldn't accommodate the weekends.
Hmm.
Um, I think the Moreno Valley one will wants to interview me and will give me a part time, but they don't know what time. So that's another reason. Like I don't want to take the job if I'm not gonna be able to do it in the next few weeks.
Yeah, so that's fine. You should let them know that you wanted to maybe wait till later in case. If not, then you can stick with your job, and then because the apprenticeship is a permanent position, some of them are full time and some of them are part time. Uh, from what I know, because some employers are looking for full time and then some employers are looking for part time, and some will work the student from part time to full time. So,
Yeah,
yeah, you can let Sarah know. I know that Jennifer is gone, and so now Sarah and um, Rachel they're taking over, and then I'm meeting with the director this week to for the district to talk about who's going to be transitioning for Jennifer's position because she moved to Oklahoma. So
yeah.
yeah, so I would tell Sarah, just email her back and let her know that you're not looking right now. You're thinking of waiting until later in case, and so that way they can just let another student interview.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, because like I don't want yeah, like I don't. I rather someone can actually do it, get the job instead of me, I'll be able to do it for a few weeks, but then I have to quit because I'm out. I'm going to Long Beach.
Yeah, so I would if you want to stick with your job now, then you can go ahead and do that. And yeah, there will be, you know, I would do that and let her know so that way she doesn't wait on you or employers doesn't wait on you, and then the next student can interview for the job. Um, yeah,
Yeah. All right.
simple.
I will. I'm glad I talked to you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so hi everyone, how are you doing? Um, well, LinkedIn had some security issues in the past, but they've been okay so far since Microsoft beefed up their end of the security. I haven't heard anything of late, but years ago they had issues until that was changed. Um, you can always turn off your resume or the toggle to look or not, Michelle. Um, I after a while I pull my resume from there because even when I turn stuff off, I still get contacted by recruiters because there are job engines that pull from there from a while back from the database. And I guess I'm in some mailing lists from long ago. But yeah, a lot of people actually got jobs via LinkedIn. So I haven't heard anything about LinkedIn issues, and I use it occasionally for networking and stuff like that. But okay, so let's are there any other questions or concern? Okay, so let's take a look at before we go into the assignments. I know things been kind of busy for everyone, so I updated your grades today. If you have anything outstanding, make sure that you work on those in the next from this week until the next few weeks. Um, Everything would close out by the beginning of June, by the first week of June. So because our final exam is in the second week of June, so I want to make sure that we are caught up. Okay, so if you have anything to submit, if it's locked, just message me and I'll unlock it for you. Okay. All right. So I will post the lecture videos and the lab videos. You can find your notes here. You can download the assignment here. We will do a lab on Azure CLI. And it's similar to AWS in that you can have a lot of the management capability. And I think it is slightly better from the CLI part because Microsoft's, devote a lot of time in implementing stuff that will work across. But you would see the same features and some of the elements are similar to AWS. So make sure you download the notes and then we'll go over the assignments. I apologize for not posting your course project. I'm unhappy with my network layout. So what you're gonna get is you are gonna get a network layout, and then all the activities that we've been doing in the lab, I'm gonna try to put it onto the criteria. So you can go back to some of your lab assignments and then revisit some of the areas that we've done, like scapy, graphing, um, automation with pexpect, stuff like that. And that would just be based on the network layout that's going to be given to you. And then you can submit some of the scripts and your playbook and things like that. And that will be your overall project. Okay. So there will be two parts. One part is the main project, the other part is to assess and also post your project. So that will be taken care of. And so you should have about 4 or 5 weeks to work on it. Okay, so let's talk about the notes. So in this week, we are going to cover Azure, which is Microsoft Cloud, and they are a competitor of AWS. but AWS by far leads in the infrastructure area for cloud, infrastructure as a service, IaaS. Microsoft, they really focus on SaaS and PaaS for platform as a service. So you do see a lot of the software development and coming from Azure. Many companies uses Azure because it's now a full supported cloud for a lot of the areas. If they are licensed with Microsoft, it's more effective to use, like SharePoint, tying with Azure database, tying with Azure, and software would tie with Azure. So at the beginning, it talks about how you would launch applications like Office 365 using Azure. You can have it remotely hosted, um, and or you can use PaaS or platform as a service, building web applications using Azure Web App Services, and so on. But you do see some portion in the infrastructure end, but it's not as strong as what you see in AWS. And so here it talks about some of the features in Azure, some of the services. And when you go through, if you visit this site, it always try to highlight when I click on it. You would find a comparison between AWS and Azure. So some of the things that we talked about, um, like if you wanted to use machine learning equivalent, that will be SageMaker in Azure. So they have some different naming convention, and then um, they dedicate a lot of the emphasis on artificial intelligence and learning machine architecture. So you see some of that. And then for the big data, you got Redshift and Lake Information that will be equivalent to Data Share and Synapse. And so here you would see a lot of stuff on big data and analytics and visualization. So you can have a lot of the stuff from the cloud. As far as what you've seen with the EC2, you have virtual machines. So when you have, when we used EC2 last week, and this week we're going to talk about VNet and using virtual machines. And so in this area, you would see that this is the area for the infrastructure. Um, and then when you deal with containers, so you have instances for the container as you would have Elastic Container Services on AWS and so on. So you can take a look at the comparison, and it listed various comparisons, so you would see the equivalent in both. So here it shows you, and it gives you the link. So you would see we are going to talk about VPN and VNet today and load balancer. Now, like AWS, you do have an option to get an account. And so when you click on this, it will take you to this page. And if you would get 12 months for what this free services. So they give you 200 credit. And so with that, what you do is you can use various services that's available with that tier. So when you sign up here, you will need a credit card just like AWS. Okay. Let me sign up with a different account here. So I can show you what it looks like. Okay. So once you have the Azure account, you can sign up for pay-as-you-go subscription that's recommended. Um, and then, or you can use an existing subscription in your account. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay. So this is what you generally see when you, after you sign up. And virtual machines is located here. So you can create virtual machines. I created one a little bit ago. This is equivalent to the users in AWS in that you can create users account. And Microsoft does a good job in setting up the least privilege. So when you try to launch some of the services under specific users or even using Azure CLI, it will pull the user account and it will give you the authentication token. And with that token, similar to what we've seen with the keys on AWS, and it's going to actually look at the privilege of the user and the group membership of the user to be able to give you the appropriate access. So this is like equivalent to users in IAM, and this is part of the identity portion of Azure. And so you can look at cost management in the case where you wanted to look at what will be billed. And then for the static web app, you can preview that here. And so you can see that there will be various areas. So you can go to the Quick Start Center, which gives you the option similar to AWS, where you can deploy virtual machine, create web app, container storage, do analytics, set up database, etc. And they walk you through the process here. Now, one of the things that the textbook talk about is after you create the account, you see the center. It talks about how you would look at the subscription pay as you go. So as that would be flexible equivalent to the elastic part of AWS. Now, one of the tool that's going to be given to you is called the Azure Shell. And the Cloud Shell is located on the top right. So you would see that here. And so you can use it to in either or. So you can have it as bash or you can use it with PowerShell. Now Azure works directly with Python SDK. So if you install Azure CLI, you're able to adapt it with Python SDK, which allows you to incorporate Python libraries. And so that way you can manage, and they are flexible in that they understand that Python has many libraries that will work across many of their services. So you can run the script in Bash or PowerShell, or if you use Azure CLI, you can tie that with Python. Okay, so in our assignment, for number one, it asks you to go to the Azure Service Comparison. You saw the page, and it wants you to identify and describe the service that is comparable to AWS EC2. And so we would see this equivalent as virtual machines. And with virtual machines, you're able to have options very similar to AWS. So even with the free account like AWS, you're able to have Linux, Windows, and other type of virtual machines. Okay. And so that way you're able to test, launch, and so on. So you would see what that will be one of the service. So for the answer, I put down that the equivalent will be virtual machines, and they are virtual servers that allow users to deploy, manage, maintain OS and server software. Instance types provide combinations of CPU and RAM, and normally you would get 8 gigs with the VRAM, and you can pay for what you use. So you can sign with the contract with pay as you go. And so in the case where you have months that you don't use as much, you would pay less in comparison to if you do a regular subscription. Okay. So here it basically described what virtual machine service would be in Azure. I'm finishing a class for Azure Essentials for the cloud administration. It really focuses on configuration for Azure. And then another class would be the AWS DevOps associates that will be tied to their Amazon certification called AWS DevOps Associates. And Azure does have quite a few certifications, starting with Azure Fundamental and going into Essentials and then other areas. So if you're looking to get certifications, you can prepare for that and take the certifications. I know Certiport support Microsoft certifications quite a bit, so you can check that out. Okay. So here it talks about virtual machines and virtual servers, how we would use that to manage and maintain our software. And in question 2, you saw that I explained that at the top, we would see Azure Cloud Shell. So for question 2, it asks you, how do you access Azure Cloud Shell? What feature of Azure Cloud Shell allows you to use pre-install Azure CLI and Python SDK? And you can use Azure Cloud Shell, which can be accessed on Azure Portal by clicking Cloud Shell button on the top right. So when you look at the portal, you would see, let me move this over. You would see that here, and that's next to the search bar. Now, as you saw when we opened the Cloud Shell, you have 2 options. You can have the PowerShell, which is really Microsoft, right? Oriented, and then you have the Bash shell, which you can use with Azure CLI and Python SDK. And it works with your virtual environment for Python. So if you enable that in your command line, right, then you can do pip install Azure. So in the next one, we're going to talk about that. And if you're using Windows environment, it's a little different in that you have to download and the MSI file and you need to run the installation. But in this one, you don't have to set up environment variables. Any question with 1 and 2? Okay. So Michelle asks, when a company stops using the cloud, how do they make sure that their data is all deleted? Say they went out of business. So it depends on the contract, Michelle. So when you when you retire the server, you would, for a cloud company, you would have to go back and you would talk to them about um, removing that from their system. And because it's backed up so many times, what they'll do is, well, by regulations, they cannot just delete your data right away. On their end, they have to maintain it for security reasons, for regulation purposes. So usually they would keep it for 5 to 7 years. And then after that, so when we tell them that, okay, we're not in business anymore, what they do is they archive the file. So it becomes data at rest. And so that would go into a different classification of data. And when they archive the file, it will only be accessed by certain technician for the portion of the cloud. Not everyone will be able to access, even internally for their employees. Um, and then after those years expire, um, then what they do is they would then remove those files. By regulations, they have to, on their end, they have to properly maintain and you know um, take those files out accordingly. Otherwise, they have certain restrictions and regulations that they have to follow as well. But they would maintain it over time only because, in the case that you have legal implications, they have some records of it. So they can go back and they can pull the information. Okay. So they don't necessarily delete it right away. And so the MOU and the SLA is what you have to go back and look at your service level agreement and, your objectives and your goal when you set that up with the cloud company. Okay. You're welcome. Okay. So here it talks about several ways that you can manage your cloud environment with Microsoft. You can use Azure CLI, you can use RESTful APIs, but the whole point in using Python is to be able to write your script so that way it can let the CLI talk to Azure instead of using the actual portal. You can use this command line environment. Like I said before, right? You might be managing servers where you don't have direct access to browser applications. So it would be helpful if we initialize the script, or we would use CLI to be able to manage our Azure services. And so later on, it goes into showing you what this would look like. Okay, so what you can do is you can use AZ as a command, and that would be for Azure CLI. And then you can enable your Python virtual environment, or you can use Python and to be able to work with CLI. So here it shows you on the Linux end how to install Azure CLI. And the command that you use, again, you would see the SAZ and -- version just tells you which version that is for Azure CLI. Now with the installing with Python SDK, you can just do pip install Azure, and then you then call Python, and then you can import Azure and you can write your script. So it allows you to access the Python shell within Linux, and you'll be able to do that. But in the next question, I have you take a look at their documentation. And so here is the installation guide. And for your own system, you can take a look at how you would install Azure CLI. So when you look at the documentation, it gives you Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. So in the Windows area, if you have Windows system, if you click this right here, it will download the MSI, the installation file for Azure CLI, and you just run the installation wizard, and then it would install the Azure CLI for you on your system. Okay, so once you have the Azure CLI in your command prompt, you would open that up, and then you want to do AZ, right? If you wanted to check version, you can do that, or you can do AZ login. And if you create the account, see, it's gonna open, it's gonna point to the interface, the UI, where it would ask for your credential. So it's gonna open the authentication API, and then you can click the account. So you're gonna get this page, and what it's saying is that now it logs you onto Azure, and then it would take you to the documentation to show you how you can get started to manage with Azure. Okay, so in a way, I feel like their API force you to go through the browser. Um, and it is in the beta state still, as you can see, right? Where in AWS, you don't have to do that. But what you can do is you have to download the auth file, and then save it to that system so it doesn't force you to go through the browser. Okay, now coming back to this here, if you go back and you look at your Mac OS, so again, you can use Brew like many of the others. So first you want to update Brew if you haven't updated it recently. If you have done that already, then you can do Brew install Azure CLI in terminal. And once you have that, you can log in, and yeah, it's going to give you, it's going to use the default browser, and it's going to load the Azure sign-in page, very similar to what you've seen on my system earlier. And then if you don't have a web browser, you would have to use the AZ login use device code, and you would have to copy the device code and paste that in, so that way it would sign you into the credential. Okay. Now for the Linux, here it shows you how you can use Debian and Ubuntu. Okay. So it supports Debian up from 8 to 10. So you can use Jesse, Stretch, 10 is Buster. So if you're using Raspberry Pi, right, Raspbian, that's Debian base. If you use Ubuntu, you can also install. And you saw in the text, so you would do curl, and then you would point to the site, and then you would do a sudo bash. Then next you have to run update, and then you have to install certificate. Okay. And then in order for it to properly work, you have to download Microsoft packages for the key sign. And because it creates the trusted GPG with Microsoft, it has to be signed. So that requires, that's why it takes you to that page, because once you sign in, it gives you the signed certificate for that actual site. And then you can add repository and update and so on. So there are several steps additional when you're using Linux compared to Mac OS or Windows. Okay, and then after that, you can test your login. And again, it says the same thing with the web browser for all. Okay. So what I did was for the answer, I just put down variations. So for Windows, we would download and install current version of CLI. And you can go to the Windows page for the installation. For Mac OS, you would install brew and use brew to install Azure CLI in terminal. So you would do brew install Azure CLI. And then for Linux, we can use curl and use bash. After that, there are additional steps that you would see on the page. So you can note those if you're using Linux. Any question? So in this book, it addressed two primary cloud provider, which is Microsoft and Amazon. There is also Google, but you would see that Azure. I know it's early, but will we be using AWS or Azure Cloud for any projects for Python 30C and E in case I wanted to use? I might be using one of them. I'll let you choose for the advanced Python one because it has to do with data and database. So I think it will be more helpful to run stuff like that instead of having it locally stored. Um, Now, if you can always sign up using a different email address, you know that in any both services. So if you have another email address that you use, you can always sign up for the free service and then it will give you the free service again. Okay. Yep. Now, I think if you have a small startup, they actually give you 7,000 credit instead of 2,000 credit, or yeah, 2,000 credit on AWS. And then Microsoft give you a whole year for free. They're trying to get people to subscribe to cloud right now, so they make it very easy to use and affordable. So we might be running, but I don't, for my class, you're not gonna use up all those hours. I really don't think so. You can always turn things off, right, and stop it when you're not using it, like I said, in both, so it doesn't accumulate hours. If it does, very little for just your profile on there. Okay, so next we're going to talk about access token. So as you saw earlier, I mentioned that you can create users. And so let me go back and show you. Okay. So if you go back to home on these are the services you would see the user here. And then if you click on the top left drop down menu, you can have access to dashboard. Okay, and dashboard kind of give you the, if you don't, let me close my shell. You can set it, it would kind of summarize all your resources. You can see that I have a cloud, I have like security set up for my cloud and so on. And then so if you, it gives you like a one-stop shop on how you can set up. So if you wanted your virtual machines, your Linux virtual machines, your Windows virtual machine. So when you use your Windows virtual machines, and if you use it, it uses RDP. So you have to use RDP to connect to it. And then if you use Linux virtual machine, you can use SSH. So I had set up my Linux virtual machines, and then you can manage your SQL and so on and so on. Okay. But so on the left right here, it also gives you options. Okay. And then if you wanted to search for something, you can always search for by keyword. So if you wanted to manage your, this is like equivalent to IAM in AWS. So here you can assign role and resources very similar to AWS. You can also have audit logs, and so on, right? And if you want privilege identity, you can manage role assignments here. The book talks about that, on how you should manage user access. So you can activate the time that you want them to use. Like if my company operates 8 to 8, I can set up a time for that privilege role. And this been done since Windows NT days. So this is nothing new. It's just now implemented for cloud usage. So that way you can disable a certain account after hours. So it just, it ties back to security and access management. So it's important. And then you can also look at how you can manage access in general. And access is a really big key in security. So we can set up rules, and we can set up other people roles and privileges in the organization. And I think they do a better job than AWS in this way, where the interface for this is a little bit easier than what you've seen with the user management with IAM in AWS, as it is a different platform, of course. But so this has been done since all their servers anyway. Okay. So that kind of give you the overall, but going back to the questions here, I want to scroll down and show you. So here it shows you very much like what I have shown you. Azure Service Principal, it restricts resources for the level-based access on roles. So you have to set up your user roles. And to really get started, you can use the role that is created with the first user account that you had, or you can also create individual roles. And when you log in, you would use AZ login. And then here it shows you how you can use Active Directory. So here it brings you to AD. And when you use this command create for RBAC SDK auth, this is for role-based access control. That's what RBAC stands for. And then SDK auth is going to be it's going to tie to the authentication that you can push using the credential with JSON and Python SDK. So in the next question, you would use AZ login to access your account. And then you saw that it would launch the browser. And it asks for your sign in. Okay. Okay. So in the next part, you saw the access control portion. Now in here, it shows you a little bit of the Python script. If you purchase the book or access his GitHub, you can get the Python file that he wrote. So in this, we can use with Python, you can import in, right, authentication and network management tools from the actual library. So with that, what you can do is you can manage your clients, you can manage the authentication portion of your client systems. And so this is the snippet of the script, of course, but here it just shows you to print out the API version. So once you have a script written like that, you can run it. Okay. So here it talks about using Bash and PowerShell. Now in the article, it talks about the benefits of using Python SDK with Azure. Okay, so let's open that up. I always click the function key instead of the control key for some reason. All right. So here it talks about how this is gonna allow us to use cross-platform. It's really designed for cross-platform use. Okay. And it is easy to distribute across all platform. So the packages will be allowing the administrator and developer to work across Windows, Linux, Mac OS, etc. Okay. And then it goes into the features. And it talks about how it has tools like self-destruct mode. So it would delete, and they can have a time or with the command line argument, so that way it cleans it up and it fits the workflow. So some of the things I want to highlight for 5 is that the benefits for using Azure Python SDK is that it produces one implementation that behaves the same across all platforms. And you don't see a lot of that, in a lot of the other areas. Because if you're looking at like AWS, you see some slight differences. There are, for most part in general, it will be the same. But then if we want it to be matching exact, so the Python community really support Azure implementation. And so you would see one implementation for the same across the platform. It provides platform specific packages for correct conventions. It has an ecosystem of extensions that empowers the user to develop workflows that fit their preferences. I'm going to delete the word hour. Okay, so those are some of the primary benefits in using Azure Python SDK. Any question? One of the things that I want to point out to you, and I know that AWS has that feature too. I don't know if you're familiar with, if you look at Azure IoT, they do have IoT services, very much like AWS. So they talk about, they give you some example there. So I tried to purchase this service with the amount of money that they funded us. And I requested it before, but they were not able to, they didn't approve my MOU at the district. But you do get free options when you sign up. Okay. So you can have like 2 system communicating. You can set that up. And it would look like this. Okay. And if you wanted to check out the pricing in case you have to pay, it's fairly affordable. So, you know, for most part, in a small scale, you might just need like a basic tier, $10 per month. Or if you use the standard tier, the one that you sign up for free, you can get 8,000 messages or 0.5 kilobyte for the message. That's the max size. So for something like a weather station or, you know, something very basic, you can probably use the free. But if you have a little bit more like voice command based things that, you know, voice recognition stuff, you might want it to go with like the basic tier. You can, I contacted AWS and Microsoft both, but what happens, because there are faculty that use, you know, cloud environment for their cloud. But if you, let's say, if I create a cloud environment for my class of 30 students and have those students, you know, use that environment to learn to pen test, they would probably allow that within. But, you know, as long as you protect it accordingly. So, but not to get, you know, not to make yourself a target on the web, that is. Okay. So here's the IoT Hub. All right. So in the next, we're going to talk about any question with number 5? Next, we're going to talk about the global infrastructure. So like AWS, you will have to use region and AZs. So Azure Global Infrastructure consists of regions and AZs and edge locations. And you can check out the page if you're interested in the geographies. Okay. And I highlighted that section for you in that it gives you a little bit overall understanding of what it is. Okay. So here it talks, if you click on geographies, it talks about geographies. Okay. So this is a map of where their data centers would be. Okay, you got quite a bit in United States, some Europe, and then you got Asia. So there are across the continent, you have South America, you have a few, and South Africa, you got one, and so on. And like AWS, we want to make sure that we select the proper geographies because we wanted to make sure that we can have the service throughput. So Azure offer regions and we wanted to check the availability for the pricing. And this allows us to have redundancy in our services for multiple AZs. So the region, unlike AWS, is organized in high order category geography. So a geography is a discrete market and it contains two or more regions. Other than latency and network connectivity, replicating services across the regions in the same geography is necessary. So you have to have in the same geography to replicate because this is required for compliance, okay, in different part of the world, okay? So on page 6, it gives you information about geography, which we are going to address in question 6. It asks you to describe Azure Global Infrastructure, its purpose, and geography. So Azure Global Infrastructure consists of regions, available zones or AZs, and edge locations. And we use it to build redundancy into the service by having the service in multiple AZs. Geography is a discrete market. It contains two or more regions. So a geography would consist of two or more regions, and region consists of available zones or availability zones. This will allow us to reduce latency, have better network connectivity, replicating services across regions in the same geography, which is required for compliance. Okay. So selecting the proper geography, region, and because when you start your instance, it's gonna put it onto what your account setting would be, and then you can choose, right? So usually for the free tier, it normally push it to the US East on both type Azure or AWS, right? You would have to think about, if you use this for your business, which region would be suitable for you and for your consumer. And then within that, we wanted to make sure that your services are replicated, database, servers, right? Even with DNS, it needs to be replicated within the same available zones in the region. So that way you have redundancy, which is required for compliance, which ties back to availability for security. Any question with Azure Global Infrastructure? You can find this information on page 6, like I said. Okay. All right. So let's move forward. In the next part, it talks about virtual networks. And you can establish a VNet, which includes virtual machines that can talk to each other. You can have a virtual machine remote into another virtual machine. You can have multiple virtual machines connecting together to establish a network. So they call it VNet. And to create that, you just create a resource and you can find that in your portal. And then you can establish the networking by setting up your virtual network. Okay. So it's important to note that each VNet is scoped to a single region, and you can create multiple subnets in a VNet. So a virtual network is tied to one region, and inside that virtual network, you can have multiple subnetworks. Okay, and you can manipulate that by using IP addresses, and you know most cloud infrastructure are using IPv4. So, okay, so an example of this would be like here. So you would have your network is named West US2 VNet 1, right? And then you would have the address space. And then you would have, within that, you would have subnet name, and then the range for your subnet. And that is done in Azure CLI. On the portal, you can create it using the portal. So you can create a virtual network, set up your address space, and then set up your subscription, and so on. Okay. So now it's important to point out that all resources within VNet can carry the outbound communication with the internet. We do not need to add a NAT gateway like AWS. So this one, they removed this option, as in it should be directly connecting to the internet. So it doesn't need the network address translation gateway in order to do that. In AWS, you have to set that up. In Azure, you don't. Okay. All you need for the inbound communication is a signed public IP that will be connecting to the VM. So when you're creating your instance, it would give you a public IP, which is what is used to bring in the traffic from the outside, right? And then you would have private IP that will be internal for your network on the cloud. So you can have your system communicating with another system in your cloud using private IP. And then when it tried to reach outside, we would have a public IP for that. Okay. Then you can also use load balancer with the public IP. And we will talk about load balancer at the end. Okay. So here, the example that he had was he had set up an Ubuntu instance, and the virtual machines, and then he would use that virtual machines to connect to another virtual machine using SSH. Okay, and with that, for the SSH inbound connection with the authentication, and then use another virtual machine to connect to it using the public IP. So that's what it's showing here. And he's able to ping, right, external servers like google.com and so on. So coming back to here, right, I have something set up here, but you can always create your virtual machines. Okay, and it walks you through on how to quickly set that up, create a Linux VM, create a Windows VM. We saw some of that already, right? And so you can follow the steps in order to set that up. I think I turned mine off. Let me see. Yeah, I didn't have anything logged. So here's my virtual network. So I named it CIS30B VNet once I created that. And this is the address space that they gave me. This is the class A because it's going to give me the most address because of the subscription that I have. Okay, which is free. And then the tags, I added the tags there, very similar to your AWS. And then the resource group is CIS30B. So you can go in and you can set up your subnet. So the default is going to be here. You can add another subnet. Okay. And then, so the default now it's going to range from, we can have it range for a different subnet. And then if you wanted to set up NAT gateway, you can, you don't have to. It's just going to funnel in from the public IP. Okay. And then we can use a load balancer for that. So here you can set, if you have security group, you can point to the security group that in existence, or you can make a new one outside of this and come back in and set that up. And then for the service endpoint, it says that to create service endpoint policy to allow traffic to specific Azure resources from your virtual network over the service endpoints. So you can set up what type of areas you want to access. So if you want SQL for database, you want storage, you want web, and so on. So you can set up different areas here by checking the box. If you select everything, that will be, you can choose select all and then you save. Okay, so we can have a subnet for a certain service, and then we just have to check the appropriate service. So you kind of see how the service endpoint would be. So for the service endpoint, the purpose of VNet endpoint service is to extend VNet to other Azure services over a direct connection that allows traffic from the VNet to Azure service to remain on the Azure network. Service endpoints need to be configured with an identified service within the region of the VNet. So the service needs to tie to the region, which ties to that physical, right, networking piece of in their data center. And it allows you to funnel in through that one connection. And that way you can also monitor traffic on that network tied to service. So for example, if I'm running like a web application that access a database, I would select the appropriate service for that part of my network. And so that way I can manage that. I would be able to see, right? Because it's gonna tie with socket, and it's gonna tie with the connections, it's gonna tie with the server information, the server IP, and so on. And all of that would tie back to the region of your VNet. And your region is going to tie to their data center. So everything would be logically flowing. There's nothing that's going to be out of ordinary or out of the regular. What you see is the logical layout of the network. Okay. And so in the section of the endpoint service, I had indicated these as well. But you can always refer to their documentation for insights. Any question with 7? Okay. So prior to that, it talks about resource location, network resource location. all that is it's gonna be able to identify. What he did here was he this script is used to create the subnet like what we would done on the portal, and then when it outputs, it's going to give you all the details there. So if you look at the portal, it would include the subnet that was created. There's some example that I put here from GitHub, and then to manage Azure with Python, you can check out the guide. Service endpoints is on page 12 for answer for number 7. Okay, so here it tells you that you do not need to create VNet service endpoint when you need your VMs to communicate with each other. We saw that earlier, right? Each VM can access the service through the public IP. You just have to set the rules to permit it, okay? And what that brings us to VNet peering. So you can have a peer connecting with a peer, and that just means that you can have a virtual machine connecting with a virtual machine, okay? And if you wanted to see your lists, your peering, to allow VNet peering, we would do a peer bidirectional in both VNets. So you can look at your VNet list by looking at, so AZ is for Azure network. VNet list command is going to give you the list of your virtual networks. Okay, so in this, Eric Chu has 2. He has East US VNet 1 and West US VNet 1. Okay, that would be the command that you would use. And then if you wanted to check the peering list, you would do AZ network VNet peering list. Okay, you're gonna get from and set and from a certain VNet name. So we'll be able to check from that particular VNet. So the command for number 8 is AZ network VNet peering list. And you can add the options or the switch and specify which VNet you're looking at. So it would pull the peering list from that particular VNet. So in each VNet, you would have virtual machines, and you would be able to set up your subnet to coordinate with your virtual machines for your virtual machines. And then you can assign roles for your virtual machines and be able to manage the access to those machines. Okay. Now, as we know that when you're going from one network to another network, even though they're virtual and they're in your same cloud, you have to route, right? So in physical, what that will do is it's going to take the traffic and it's still going to send it to the router that's going to be connecting across where your host would have different IPs. So with that, what we would need to do is we would need to set up your routing table. So here it goes into VNet routing, and you can do it through the portal, or you can do it through the CLI, and we'll talk about how to use CLI. Okay. Now, if you have your network set up, it's going to map out the topology where it shows you how each of these would be interconnected. And it would rely on your interface, which is in this case your NIC Okay. So with that, we have to include your network security group. So very similar to AWS where you have to set up your security group. All that is gonna filter, right, your traffic. So it acts like a firewall. Then, but we have to be able to tell it how to route. Okay. And once you have your route table, then we can have it activated for a specific area of our network. So when I'm trying to use one subnet that has an IP address, for example, 192.168.0. whatever, and I'm trying to send traffic to 10.0.0. whatever, it has to go through a router because they are two separate networks. So then what you need to do is you need to set up a way for it to see how it should be connecting. Okay, so in the next question, we are going to look at how we would use the Azure CLI in order to do that. And you can also see the documentation here. So in the next one, in Azure CLI, how do you create a routing table named route table 1 for CIS30B resources in subnet T sub1 within West US 1 VNet 1 to include new route that connects to the virtual appliance with IP address 172.10.0.1 to the next hop IP 10.0.1.30. So this is the router from the 172 network, and it's going to connect with another router that is in the 10 network, 10.0.1.x network, right? So first, what we need to do is we need to create a route table. So you would do in Azure CLI, you would do AZ network, route table create. And first we need to name our table that will be route table 1 and the resource CIS30B, whatever you name your resource. Okay. And this has to exist. So then after that, we are going to have a new route in that table tied to the appliance with the address. So in the second step, we would do AZ network route table, route create G, CIS30B, route table name, route table 1, new route. So now this is going to be the route name for that hop. So first you make a table, then you would identify the route name and tie that to your IP address prefix for the appliance. Okay. And here is your address prefix. Now, why am I not putting in the route? Well, because what I'm saying is that anything from that subnet, it's going to connect to the next hop, that router 10.0.1.30. It's going to go from this network to the next router. Because the route is a path from one router to the next. So we wanted to set up from this segment to the next hop. Okay, so it's like you drawing a road from one part of the network to the next router. Okay. And then we're going to update it because once you set that up, it doesn't go into effect until you update it. So you would do AZ network VNet, subnet update from the resource CIS30B, with this subnetwork with this name, and then route table 1. So those are the 3 sets that needs to be established. Now, when we do this with the portal, there will probably be about three pages that you would need to configure. So it's about the same. Any question with setting up route table? Okay. So this gives you a little bit of the background on how to establish route with the virtual appliance for your cloud network on Azure for your virtual machines. So here it goes into how if you need to override your default route, if you specify it like what we've done just now, it would override the default route. Because they're using appliances that use BGP, okay, which is going to be site-to-site VPN or express route, which we'll talk about that in a little bit, or the system route. So what you can do is you can make your routing table and you would associate it with the subnets. And then Azure, you can let Azure select the route based on the priority, and you just set the priority based on values. So the lower the value, the higher the priority. The higher the value, the lower the priority. Okay. So on page 16, it goes through, it shows you how you can do that with the interface. And then to write it, sorry, it's kind of small. I try to screen capture the whole section there, but this is where you can also find the details for that answer. And then with that, we need to implement network security groups, which allows us to filter. So here it lets you create rules for inbound and outbound. Okay. So earlier we mentioned that there's priority level. So you can have it all the way up to 65,000. Like I said, if you make it really high, that means it's low on the priority. Okay. So by default, virtual network can freely communicate with each other in both directions. But if you wanted to slow down on one direction, you can set the priority lower. Okay. And then internal hosts are allowed to access internet. So we can block that if we need to. And you know, Microsoft for firewall rule, they let you click and put in the port ranges. So it's easy to kind of set that up, or you can use the command line. So in the next question, it asks you to write a command in Azure CLI to create 2 inbound rules under lab Nsg for CIS30B Azure instance to allow SSH and SSL connection. So SSH is port 22. We learned that already. And then SSL is port 443. This is the old, this is secure socket layer. This is the old encryption for HTTPS. We don't use SSL anymore. We use TLS. We replace SSL with TLS, but in this one, you can do it this way. So you would do AZ network NSG. So you would always start with AZ network if you want to configure a network for Azure. Then in this one, we configure NSG, create, okay? And we are going to use the resource CIS30B. And we're going to name our NSG as lab NSG. So new lab NSG. Then we are going to make, now we have to specify the specific rule under that. So we would repeat the same thing up to here. Okay. And then we would then add the option NSG, name lab NSG, then a new rule, allow underscore SSH, priority 150. So this is high priority. It starts with 100 and it goes to 65,000. So when you see something close to 100, that means it's higher in priority. And then we would have direction bound, source address prefixes internet, destination port range is 22. This is for your SSH. Access allow, protocol TCP, description permit SSH inbound. So we are allowing connection using SSH from outside, from web, or from other sources of address. So if you terminal into that system, you can, right? That's what we want to do. Then on the second rule, again, we are going to make a new rule with the resource CIS30B. We are going to name it lab NSG allow SSL. This one is lower in priority, as we would have priority 160. And this is going to be direction inbound, source address prefixes internet, destination port ranges 443. We would allow SSL inbound. Okay. So in this, you would see that this would be like a drop-down menu and you would select, you would enter the port number, and then you would set the rule. You would give it a name, right? Like what you've seen with the screen capture for the NSG. But if you do it in CLI, right, it does take about one line. It is a little bit detail oriented, but very clear. Now, after we set up the rules, we gotta bind them to the subnet because it would not be effective until we bind it. Okay. So for 11, after we set the rules, we would use AZ Network VNet, subnet update. We would bind it to the subnet, CIS30B, T sub 1, VNet, and whatever your VNet name is. Okay. And then you would bind network security group, lab NSG, which you have these rules. It's going to apply now to that subnet. Any question? Okay, so far you see how we would use CLI with these commands. Got a little bit of practice here. And so if you want, you can create your account. You can set up your your VNet, and then you can play with it a little bit. You can install Azure CLI. We will work on that in the lab this week. Okay. Okay, we only have a few more to go, so not too bad. I'm gonna finish pretty soon. Okay, so your network security groups overview is there. It gives you the screenshot. This is what we set up, similar to what Eric Chu has. And then you can also set up other rules that are lower in priority with the higher values. And then you still need to bind it. Okay. So in the next phase, we're going to talk about VPN Gateway. And VPN Gateway in the VNet is a way that we can encrypt traffic between VNet and our remote clients or our network. Each VNet can only have one VPN gateway, and that's important to note. Okay. But you can use it for multiple connections at the same time in the same gateway. You can look at VPN documentation. So now here it talks about how VPN gateways are virtual machines, and it's used to configure encryption and routing services, but cannot be directly configured by the user. So Azure, they give you the SKUs that will be for tunneling and concurrent connections with the throughput. So if you need to connect point to site, you can look at the documentation and they'll tell you. So there are two types. There's the P2S, which is point to site VPN, which allows secure connection to client system. So if you have people who are remote working, you can have them use point to site. And you would choose the type of VPN gateway SKU for P2S. So when you look at the categories here, okay, you would look at these two. So you have to use IKE or SSTP for site to site. So for the site to site VPN encryption method can be SSTP, an IKE v2, or OpenVPN connection. The majority of the service for VPN on the web is OpenVPN. Okay. You do see some site to site, which costs a little bit more, and then point to site, which also costs. Okay, so here what you see is they would give you the list of SKU. These are machines that will be configured to encrypt, right, to tunnel your traffic. Okay, so here it gives you the diagram for client base. So you have a client, another client, another client, and they would communicate with the VPN gateway, which is usually it would have like an address, and then they authenticate to it. And then after they authenticate to it, they will be brought into this network. Okay, and that's how VPN works. So it uses the tunnel protocol. Now, for the site to site, so if I have, let's say, one location and another location like my branches, I can have those also use a VPN gateway, and that will be connecting to the cloud network here. Okay. So that you would use for sites, or you can use for clients, which is the other. So in the next question, it asks you for the purpose for VPN gateway. It's used to encrypt traffic between a VNet and the network and the clients. You can only have one VPN gateway for each VNet, which includes multiple connections. The two types of Azure VPN, sorry, this got dropped down, is your point to site, which is P2S VPN, and it allows secure connection from an individual client system. It's used for remote workers. Site-to-site VPN, it is an encryption. It uses SSTP, Open VPN connection, and that's used for organization connecting multiple sites, networks together. And then we only have one more to go. Any question with these? I'll leave it on for a little bit. You can always refer to the notes under the VPN Gateway section. It talks about different types there, along with what it is and how it should be used. Okay, so initially when you set up your machines, you would see that it would be open to public. How do you incur changes for DDoS attack for your cloud services? I'll get into that in 1 second. Give me 1 second, okay? Okay, so in the last one, before we answer that, let's take a look at this right here. So in the next portion, it talks about express route, and express route is a way that we would connect for mission critical traffic. And this gives us a lot more reliability with the connection, very similar to AWS Direct Connect. Azure uses express route. This is a private connection, and of course it incurs costs to the provider. Okay, so like government entity, companies that want direct connect with their vendors, with their distributors, etc. So it allows you to use express route. Okay, and the advantage is of course when it's private, it's faster, it's reliable, right? But it's difficult to set up, and because it requires a lot of technical requirements, the cost of it is higher. Then you can use load balancer, and you can refer to load balancer information here. The way that the diagram is laid out here, you would have it set up as a load distribution through other systems instead of the actual load balancer. So it's a little bit different. Okay, so what you see here is like a way that you would distribute it across your virtual machines, and then those virtual machines would then pass it through the internal load balancer, and then it would bring it to the database. Okay. So here are additional services that were related to the network. You can have DNS services, which when you create your instance for your virtual machines, um, you can also set up your DNS. And then you would have other containers, storage, stream, etc. So Michelle had a question about Azure DDoS protection. Okay. Now, if things are wide open to the public, you know that it's would be prone to distributed denial of service. So we wanted to make sure that we have proper protections. And the standard that they have is for application. It uses the application firewall, um, which comes back. So your load balancer is actually an application-based server. And what it does is it's going to be able to detect activity. So they use an application-based firewall for the individual endpoints. And then with this, if you have the basic protection, it's only going to use the rules that have been set up, okay, to detect and mitigate. So it is an IPS, okay? Um, and so it's tuned to be able to do that, and it uses logging and alerting. So it is an IPS, okay? Now, if you get the full standard protection, this gives you insurance. You can customize your policies based on, you know, your historical data, trends, things like that that you bring in from your network. Uh, you can set up measurement with your alert systems, and then you can look at what was eliminated in the report, because those that got wiped out, you wanted to look at them because they might come back again. So so you look at the reports and the logs, and then with how fast it would be responding to each of the type of distributed denial of service attack. So with the standard, it would incorporate what we would see as in a customizable intrusion prevention system, um, that they call it intuitive behavior detection type of intrusion prevention systems that's incorporated at the data center. So when you set this up, really, number one, you're setting up security appliance. Number two, you can also incorporate the software side of the house in order for protection measure. So when you see a lot of stuff that would be tied to the DMZ, because there are a lot of the things that would be public front, like your DNS is going to be public front, your web server is going to be public front, some of your database is going to be public front. So what you would have is you would have a firewall at your DMZ section, and what they would do is they would put the application firewall within those systems that would be public front, and then tie that with the, you know, more of the monitoring system for the network detections and the logs and things like that. So when you add that, this standard protection, what that does is it's going to tie into a lot of the monitoring customizable capability with the security appliance, where in most cases you would see for most part is application firewall that's being used here in the basics. Okay. And then some of the features they will tell you here. Okay, that's what we talked about. And then the pricing can be all different. So in the case that, you know, as all of the cloud resources would then use public IP, it's discoverable, of course. And then you can follow the packets back. And if they don't have any protection, you can actually trace it back to the instances and how it's networked with the rest of the subnet. But if you have some form of protection, it would be able to detect that. So I think with Azure and Microsoft on the front end, you have at least a basic protection, which is usually standard. But you know that when you sign a cloud contract, you're liable for 50% of the security. If you get attacked, they're only liable up to 50%, if any. If you have a full infrastructure on the cloud, usually you're liable for 75% of your own security. So the company that hosts it only is liable for 25% or less, depending on the contract. So that means that if you lose your data, right, or if you have a breach, right, if you don't have any additional packages, your cost protection will not be even covered. So, so it doesn't always mean that when you put it onto the cloud, they're fully liable for your stuff. No, it's just you using somebody else's racks, and then you have to protect your own system. So now, if you incur charges for the DDoS attack, it's depending on how you customize this. And if attacks occur, it would give you the report and the logs, and they would bill based on that. Okay. And that kind of wrap up on what I have to cover for today. Do you have any questions for me? Addition to what we talked about. So if you have some time, check out the free Azure account. And then, just expect that we will be using Azure CLI, and it would only be effective if you have an account. If you can't sign up for one, let me know. But the free account should last you a long time. Okay. All right. Type your name into the chat. That wraps up our session for today. And if you miss anything, let me know. Have a good afternoon. I will see you on Wednesday. We will have one or two more chapter, and then, and then we'll have final review. Have a good one.